Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
It's like The Amazing Race, Joe. Never know where you're going to find us, how quickly we can get
Where's
there.
the prize? I'm still looking for it.
We'll have to ask management about that one. But of course, there was a reason why we did this. We were in New York yesterday, where all of the surrogates had gathered for the vice presidential debate, the first and only one of its kind of this 2024 election cycle, and also very likely the last kind of debate of any kind that we will see before Election Day on November 5th, because I would remind everyone here on Bloomberg TV and radio, there is no second presidential debate scheduled, and it's not clear whether the performance of the running mates last night would have changed any minds of their presidential counterparts on the ticket as to whether or not they wanted to share a stage again.
And now it's back in the field, certainly for Kamala Harris to Georgia today. Joe Biden in the Carolinas surveying damage, getting briefed on the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. They don't wait around too long after a night like that to try to seize the news flow. By the way, producer Matt says the prize is Representative Seth Moulton. We should let everyone know the congressman from Massachusetts will be with us in just a moment.
Indeed.
First, our conversation with Laura Davison, of course, Bloomberg politics editor, who had a late night as well. Laura, it's good to see you here at the table. Now that we've had a little bit of time to distill what we saw and heard, J.D. Vance is getting a lot of credit for his performance last night. Does it matter who won, though, when we're talking about a vice presidential debate?
You know, I saw a chart. It was a joke, but I'll note it was a Venn diagram of, people who watched the debate and undecided voters, and it was two circles. There was no overlap there.
Okay.
So this probably didn't do a lot to change hearts and minds. It probably did help Vance a little bit on the fundraising front. He's been one of the key people out fundraising for Trump, and the image of himself he presented is a much more palatable version of Trumponomics to voters, to Wall Street, to donors in particular. So, he maybe, helped burnish his image a little bit, but whether this makes a difference on the 10,000 voters in Pennsylvania that matter, probably not.
Well, and if we're assuming that there was a decent chunk of the American electorate that did not watch all 90 minutes of this last night, they may see, though, what was clipped in the aftermath, including the exchange between Tim Walz and J.D. Vance over January 6th and whether or not Donald Trump lost the 2020 election, which J.D. Vance would not say yes or no to. He said, "Tim, I'm focused on the future." Is that the moment of this debate that is going to have the longest shelf life?
Certainly in the coverage this morning, that has been the clip that has come out the most. And notable that it is in, just the final minutes of a 90-minute debate. Walz, seemed to struggle a little bit in the first 30 minutes in particular until the conversation turned to abortion, which really is, his and the Harris campaign's strongest issue. But, when you don't have a lot of people watching the full 90 minutes, and you have people picking up 30 seconds here and 30 seconds there on social media, that makes a difference.
That's fascinating to me, though, and it makes a difference in their overall impression of what happened last night. Some of us old people stayed up and watched it live, and it was appointment viewing, and we have our ideas. The internet brings a completely different, it's like going back to the radio versus TV thing in Nixon Kennedy. Now, I guess the internet's the new TV. If that's the only way you consume the debate, you might have walked away, thought Tim Walz won. You have a completely different impression of people who saw it live.
And remember, too, that when people are watching online, they're seeing, information that the algorithm is feeding toward them.
Sure,
so
right.
It really, is very much a dichotomy of, who is seeing what. But it probably does help, get people, either more excited about voting or, potentially fired up to donate or get their friends out to vote.
It was interesting, and Joe and I were discussing this just a few minutes ago, the kind of subjects that weren't broached by the moderators that the candidates had to bring up organically or just didn't have a chance to address at all. Ukraine was one of them. There also was the conversation around Hurricane Helene, in which the Southeast is still recovering from, may take quite a while, only asked about through the lens of climate change, with the lack of clear answers perhaps on the part of J.D. Vance and possibly Tim Walz as well on that front. But Hurricane Helene is what Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are focusing on today after fielding a lot of criticism from the Trump campaign for not going to those affected by the disaster sooner than this.
Yeah, Trump was there early. He was there on Monday in Georgia, some of the less affected areas. Biden today will be in the Carolinas, which has really gotten the brunt of the damage and the loss of life. I will note that Trump criticized Harris for being in California fundraising instead of focusing on the hurricane over the weekend. Today, Trump is fundraising in Texas. So there's a little bit of a tit for tat there. But this is going to be a potentially defining issue for the election. You have two swing states that are affected. There's already questions in North Carolina about, how people are going to be able to vote, polling places affected, polling workers affected, mail-in ballots, et cetera.
Yeah, the turnout question and the ground game question is massive. And of course, you want to address the humanitarian impact first before you really breach the political one, but it could be incredibly real.
No, that's absolutely right. In fact, it's in this hour that Joe Biden's expected to arrive in South Carolina on the first stop, and we'll let you know how he's making his progress through the South today. Kamala Harris in Georgia once again.
Yeah, Bloomberg's Laura Davison, politics editor for us. Thank you so much. And as we consider what has happened domestically in just the last few days, not just the hurricane, but also the dock worker strike, that has not been all the news cycle has brought us as this campaign enters its final 5 weeks. Also news from the Middle East as Iran yesterday launched 180 missiles at Israel. Those were largely intercepted, but this is something that was talked about on the debate stage last night. It was the very first question that was fielded by Walz and Vance, and this is some of what Senator Vance had to say.
Iran, which launched this attack, has received over $100 billion in unfrozen assets thanks to the Kamala Harris administration. What do they use that money for? They use it to buy weapons that they're now launching against our allies and, God forbid, potentially launching against the United States as well. Donald Trump recognized that for people to fear the United States, you needed peace through strength. They needed to recognize that if they got out of line, the United States global leadership would put stability and peace back in the world.
So for more on what's happening in the Middle East and the policy surrounding it, we turn now to Democratic Congressman Seth Moulton of Massachusetts, who is, of course, a veteran and a member of the House on Armed Services Committee. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. We heard that kind of notion, not just from J.D. Vance, but many Republicans yesterday as the attack was ongoing and in its aftermath, the suggestion that it could have been a result of this administration being too soft on Iran. Is there any validity in that?
No, I mean, let's just go back in time a minute to the Trump administration and understand what their policy did. They pulled out of the nuclear agreement, which not only kept Iran over a year away from a bomb, but gave us very tight surveillance on exactly what they were doing. So even if you're someone who just believes that we ultimately need to strike them militarily, we had the intelligence back then to know exactly where to hit them. But Trump pulled out of that deal. As a result, Iran accelerated its nuclear program, so that now they're within just a few weeks of producing a bomb. And Trump replaced that program, that deal, with what he called a maximum pressure campaign. And his Secretary of Defense testified before our committee on the Hill. He said there were three goals of the maximum pressure campaign. One, to keep them away from building a nuclear weapon. Two, to force them to the negotiating table to get a better deal. And three, to reduce their support for other militias in the region. On all three counts, Trump's plan failed miserably because they're way closer to making a bomb. They were pushed further away from the negotiating table, and we've seen the effects of their support for militias in the region. So the reality is that our Iran policy is in tatters because of Donald Trump, not because of the Biden-Harris administration.
Well, I wonder, Congressman, and welcome back, what you think Israel's next move should be. They're promising a significant response to what happened yesterday. And I just wonder your thoughts here. As a combat veteran Marine, what would be considered proportionate? What would be appropriate? I know that the Biden administration is trying to contain this, but should Israel not strike at Iran's nuclear program?
Well, Joe, proportionate and appropriate are really important questions here, not just for Israel, but for the United States, because let's be clear, we do not want to get drawn into a war in the Middle East with Americans fighting and dying and taking our eye off the ball in the Pacific, where our number one national security threat, something that Democrats and Republicans agree on, is with China's threat to Taiwan. So how do we achieve that while also sending Iran a very strong message that they can't just shoot 180 ballistic missiles at Israel, a close ally of ours, with impunity? So there has to be a response, but it has to be a response calibrated correctly to send a very strong, definitive message to Iran, but also not start a war that involves the United States. I remember back to decisions we made in Iraq, where when my Marine unit first showed up in Najaf, a town that had been controlled by the army. The army had this uneasy truce with the militants that allowed them free rein in parts of the city. We thought that was totally unacceptable. So we initially made a huge show of force with our patrols right into places the army refused to go, in part to draw out the militants, to make them attack us so that then we could respond, have a fair fight, and ultimately finish them off. That's an example of where we wanted to provoke a response. In many ways, this is kind of the opposite. You want to send a very clear message to Iran, but ultimately it's a message of deterrence, not something that provokes a wider war that's not in Israel's interest nor in the interests of the United States.
President Biden was asked as he was boarding the plane bound for South Carolina today, Congressman, if he would support an attack on Iran's nuclear sites. He answered no. Is that because it is too great of a provocation?
Well, that's the question, really. And we have intelligence estimates that can try to get at this. What would Iran's response be if we tried to take out their nuclear facilities? Actually, the most important question that we have to ask is how quickly would they reconstitute their nuclear capabilities? And would they then just go right to producing a bomb? Whereas up until now, even though they're very close, they have the weapons material to produce a bomb, they haven't actually built a nuclear weapon. That's a really important question, because I get the fact that it sounds like a great opportunity here, just bomb their nuclear program into oblivion. But what happens next really matters. And if what happens next is that they very quickly reconstitute their program, but actually then have live nuclear weapons because they say, okay, we learned our lesson, we're not going to let this happen again, then we've actually taken a step backwards. And that's why the president is being very careful about advising Israel on whether or not to target their nuclear program, as opposed to all sorts of other targets like the ballistic missile program that was actually used against Israel for this response.
Congressman, we had a recent conversation with you about stolen valor and some of the criticisms or accusations against Tim Walz misrepresenting some of his military service record. I expected this was going to come up in the debate last night. These are charges that J.D. Vance has repeatedly leveled against Tim Walz, and we never went there. And I just wonder what your thought was, if that might be what we call progress at this current moment in American politics.
Well, I'm an optimist, Joe, and I'd like to say that's progress because the debate last night, if there's one thing you can say about it, it was actually quite respectful. And that's the kind of political dialogue that we should see in the United States of America. Now, there were a lot of things that J.D. Vance said that were simply untrue. I'd love to get not only to respectful, but to truthful when we have a debate. But the fact that they didn't just attack each other's service was certainly heartening to, I think, many of us veterans who were watching last night.
Well, I think a lot of us were surprised by the true political conversation, substantive policy conversation that these two seem to be having. But there was not just a military service thing that was avoided on the stage, and maybe that is to the benefit of the American people, but other subjects as well, like the ongoing war in Ukraine. There wasn't even a direct question asked about policy when it comes to China, though the candidates did work that into some of their answers about other subjects. As we have these foreign policy conversations surrounding the Middle East, was there something missing last night, Congressman? Did the American people need to hear from, say, J.D. Vance what his views were on Ukraine?
Look, I think there's a lot missing because even though presidential elections are almost always focused primarily on domestic issues, that's usually how presidents win elections, this is an incredibly dangerous time for us in the world. And we've got this conflagration in the Middle East that could explode overnight into an all-out war drawing in the United States. Xi Jinping could choose to invade Taiwan any day, which would literally start World War III. I mean, we're talking about war games that predict this goes nuclear. So everybody in the world would be affected by a war in the Pacific. And of course, we have an ongoing conflict in Ukraine that's absolutely devastating, not only to the Ukrainian people, but to economies around the world and to, it's a real threat to the future of NATO. Donald Trump is on Putin's side with Ukraine. Let's not mince words. He is on Russia's side in their war of aggression. He refused to even say in his own debate whether he wanted Ukraine to win. I mean, this is unbelievable. And yes, J.D. Vance should have been asked to answer that question and explain this horrendous, really traitorous policy that he and his boss have when it comes to the war in Ukraine and the threat that it poses to all of Europe. So that's a very important topic, and I sure wish we got into it last night.
Indeed. A couple of other things I wish we'd heard more about. Congressman, it's good to see you. Thanks for helping us understand and distill what we saw and heard last evening. Seth Moulton, the Democrat from Massachusetts, beaming in loud and clear in the city of Boston on 92.9 FM, our new signal in Boston. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. We'll assemble our panel next, Kailey, with takeaways from last night. Not so much about who won or who lost, but whether this left a dent or made any impact on the campaign.
And what further catalyst might there be if there is no other debate after this? We have less than 5 weeks to go. We'll have more next year on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Back in Washington after yesterday's vice presidential debate in New York, where we were as well. But now it's the day after the debate, and the candidates once again are on the move, including Kamala Harris, heading to Georgia today to survey in part the aftermath of Hurricane Helene in that critical battleground state. Joe Biden, for his part, is viewing the aftermath as well. He should be touching down any minute now in Greenville, South Carolina. He will then head to North Carolina later today. And Joe, we just heard from the White House press secretary Karine Jean-Pierre that tomorrow he will make his own trip to Georgia as well as Florida.
Yeah, I guess they'll be crisscrossing essentially through the southeastern states. And remarkable to think that all of this happened in two of the most important swing states that will decide this election, with a lot of questions about voter turnout, ballot access, and so forth. They're actually gaggling on Air Force One right now. Karine Jean-Pierre and Alejandro Mayorkas, of course, the Homeland Security Secretary, talking about the president's need to interact with individuals. He's going to be meeting with first responders, state, local police. When he gets to South Carolina, we'll do an aerial tour of North Carolina. And Kailey, we're sending 1,000 soldiers, it seems, to help with the recovery effort as well. All this emerging on Air Force One today.
Yeah, and of course that recovery effort is still ongoing. While we know that nearly 200 people have been killed by this storm, there are still hundreds unaccounted for, and the repair work needed for transit infrastructure and the like to get these people clean food or clean water and the food that they need, all of that could take some time still.
Clean water is going to be a major factor as we work our way through this. Let's assemble our panel as they consider the political optics behind all of this. Rick Davis, of course, is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist, and partner at Stone Court Capital, alongside Kristen Hawn, Democratic strategist and partner at ROKK Solutions here in Washington. Rick, what's your thought on this? The potential opportunities and pitfalls that come with staging political optics around a natural disaster. Everyone's going to get their chance. Trump was in Georgia on Monday. Now it's Biden and Harris.
Yeah, well, I think you start with Biden, and that is he is the most empathetic president we've had in a long time. I mean, he can connect with people who have had issues. He's had a lot of practice doing it as both senator, vice president, and now as president. And so I would anticipate that he is a positive force in all this. He'll connect with folks on the ground on this trip, make the right comments about support, and frankly, do the job. You know, he's got a day job being president of the United States, and handling these kinds of disasters is probably one of the most important things he could do as president. I think it's a real test for Kamala Harris. We haven't seen her in this role that often, and she's now going to be front and center. How she connects with people, what she says off the stump when she's in these situations. She has to be able to show empathy, caring, a resolve to improve the situation of these people who have been under so much stress, and take action. I mean, action is something I think that goes underrated. I think Donald Trump gets credit for being action oriented. See, you'll point over to the truck. This truck has stuff that everybody needs here today that I brought. Action. What he lacks is empathy. And so I think that'll be a big contrast this week and see how it shakes out.
Well, Kristen, as we consider the different responses we may get from the candidates, it's also worth pointing out that Donald Trump did get there first. He was in Georgia earlier this week, days before Harris or Biden will make their presence known. Obviously, we heard from the administration that they did not want to go to these affected areas until it was not going to be disruptive for them to do so. But optically, are they arriving too late?
I don't think so. I mean, as Rick said, they both have day jobs. And when you're moving around the president and the vice president, it's just incredibly disruptive. So, I think that Kamala is a very, when you see her on in these moments where she's interacting with people, I think she's got the right kind of demeanor. And I think that ultimately she will demonstrate that she, can be this person, can be this president. I mean, Biden is like Rick said, it's one of his strong suits. But I immediately thought back to, Puerto Rico and President Trump, being on the ground even when, maybe it was a little bit too early. Some say yes, no, but throwing paper towels at people, he doesn't play that role, and we've seen him in that role and fail at it miserably. So while he may be action oriented, I think this is time when Kamala Harris should shine.
Well, of course, it was the running mate's turn last night, and we've been trying to better understand the impact, if there was any, from this vice presidential debate. And we'd love both of you to weigh in on this. Bring you back to an interesting moment. Remembering the rules, or at least those that were agreed upon here with CBS, were a bit different than what we had seen. Microphones were to be unmuted. They did actually end up muting the mics at one point. And the moderators were not to fact check. At least that's what had been reported. The CBS was going to leave this up to the candidates. It didn't end up working out that way, as we'll remind you now.
Just to clarify for our viewers, Springfield, Ohio does have a large number of Haitian migrants who have legal status, temporary protected status.
Well, Margaret, but
thank you, Senator. We have so much to get to.
Margaret, I think it's important because
we're going to turn out of the economy. Thank
Margaret,
you.
The rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check, and since you're fact checking me, I think it's important to say what's actually going on.
Okay, awkward at best as we're talking about the matter in Springfield. Remember Ohio eating cats and dogs and the rest of it. Rick, what does it say when we've gotten to this point where it's okay for a politician to comfortably push back on the idea of being fact-checked? Shouldn't they welcome it?
I don't think we're in an era where truth prevails. So if you have a slippery slope on truth, then no, people don't want to be fact-checked. And this kind of fell into the category of, we have a different version of the truth, the old Kellyanne Conway line, right? And can there really be a different version of the truth? Yeah. I mean, they're either, these immigrants are either there under legal protected status or they're not. It doesn't matter how they got the legal protected status, which is what J.D. Vance was saying. I actually would argue that the more he talked, the worse it was for him to try and explain legal protected status for an immigrant under the law. So look, I mean, it was a sloppy debate. The moderators did things they said they weren't going to do, as you pointed out, and I think that opened it up for the contestants to do whatever they want to do. And obviously, that didn't add to a positive discourse. That being said, I thought it was a minor disturbance and otherwise a pretty sanguine debate.
Yeah, it was largely civil, pretty respectful. They shook each other's hands. They agreed with each other frequently, frankly, throughout the debate. Kristen, I think a lot of people were expecting that you perhaps could see some more fire on the stage than we actually got. And instead, what we saw, at least on the part of J.D. Vance, was putting an attempt to put real substance behind some of the policy issues that we hear Donald Trump just kind of floating at rallies, putting out there, trying to explain the view of the ticket when it comes to the economy and hit home the message that we've heard Donald Trump kind of touch on, perhaps to varying degrees of success, that if Kamala Harris were going to be able to address the economy, address the border, address all of these things, she had the opportunity to do so over the last 3.5 years. Is Vance now the effective messenger for the Trump campaign? Does that give you cause to worry, what you saw from him on the stage last night?
I mean, beyond him just lying and good, the fact that they are so blatant about not wanting the facts to be out there, and I leave it to a very accomplished journalist to say, no, they're not illegal, aliens. And so I appreciated that, actually. I think the way that this whole debate, went down, I think that, JD Vance, I'd say unfortunately from my side, but he takes the policies of the Trump campaign and makes them seem normal. He's very good at this. He's very polished. So it can be very concerning to Democrats that you have somebody that's not like Donald Trump. He's not, taking the bait. He's not going to rallies and going on in incoherent ways for, hours on end. He's espousing the same dangerous policies, but saying it in a way that I think, could really relate to people. He's a good looking guy. He delivers it in the right way. I think where he really had some trouble was on the issue of abortion. They do not have an answer for that. I think he came off as weak. Tim Walz clearly, Democrats have a clear message on this. The Republicans are trying to play it on both sides, and they haven't been successful. But, he is a good messenger.
Well, indeed, Rick, I wonder if we're going to see more of J.D. Vance after what took place last night. If you were running that campaign, would you not want him out in front of the cameras, essentially sanding down the edges, as we keep hearing from analysts this morning, on Trump policies and statements?
Yeah, I think it's a new potential weapon in the arsenal of the Mar-a-Lago team. I would definitely move him around the media more. I think his shtick on the campaign trail has been to get into sort of combative exchanges with the media, but I think more long form kind of interviews where he can do exactly what you've just been describing, sort of take the sharp edges off of the MAGA movement, is very helpful to the campaign. Now, I would say it's not very helpful to the base. I mean, the base doesn't want to hear all this sort of, Chamber of Commerce version of Donald Trump, right? They want the fire and brimstone, bring back Donald. She's a communist. You didn't see that last night. My guess is if you took a poll in MAGA world, they'd say, oh, yeah, the guy was okay, but kind of a flake, right? I mean, the squish, all those terms we used to, refer to people as, who weren't like hardcore conservatives.
All right, Rick Davis and Kristen Hawn, our political panel on this day after the vice presidential debate. Thank you both so much for joining us as we consider what's going to come next, because that was it. No more scheduled debates in this cycle, Joe. No more for sure known events. Well, we'll see multiple candidates sharing a space between now and November 5th.
What do we do for the next 5 weeks? Wait for the October surprise. You know it's coming. We'll have more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Thanks for being with us here on the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. You can always find us on YouTube as well. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. This day after Iran chose to attack Israel directly for the second time in 6 months, firing nearly 200 missiles, as we've been reporting. It was happening right at this time yesterday. We've since learned a bit more from the Pentagon, knowing, of course, that the U.S. helped to repel an attack by Iran against Israel in April, where we saw American fighter pilots shooting down drones and rockets air to air. It was a little bit different yesterday. The Pentagon reporting that 2 Navy destroyers fired about a dozen interceptors against the Iranian missiles, those destroyers including the USS Cole. Having heard as well from President Biden, who gave the go-ahead for the U.S. to take part in this mission. Let's listen.
At my direction, the United States military actively supported the defense of Israel, and we're still assessing the impact. But based on what we know now, the attack appears to have been defeated and ineffective. And this is testament to Israeli military capability and U.S. military. It's also a testament to intensive planning between the United States and Israel to anticipate and defend against the brazen attack we expected.
So for more on what's happening in the Middle East and the kind of retaliation we could expect from Israel and potentially Iran in return, we turn now to Alex Vatanka. He is director of the Iran Program and senior fellow of the Black Sea Program at the Middle East Institute. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Alex, it's good to have you as we follow this news flow. Israel, of course, is promising retaliation and consequences for the events of yesterday. Iran, in return, is vowing a stronger response if Israel does retaliate. But you pointed out yesterday in a post on X that you see Iran as holding a bad hand here. So how powerful and strong of a response is Iran really capable of delivering?
Oh, it's great to be with you. Look, I mean, it's important not to underestimate the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's not a regime that is popular with its own people. And one of the things I pointed out yesterday, I think it's the elephant in the room. The Iranian regime doesn't have the support of the Iranian people for what it is doing in the region. What it's doing in terms of supporting these proxies and certainly its opposition against Israel's right to exist as a country, these are not policies that the regime has the backing of the Iranian people for. So the regime knows that. And I think that is going to be a big part of why they are hoping that their volley of missiles that they fired at Israel yesterday will not be met by major response from Israel. We have to wait and see. But that's the hope in Tehran, because they really do want to move on. Because I think fundamentally what the Iranian regime is banking on is this sort of long war against Israel, war of attrition. Have groups like Hamas and Hezbollah bleed the Israelis year in, year out, and Iran can sit away 500 miles away and just watch this show. Well, you've seen the Israelis are saying it's not going to happen. We're going to take the war to Iran, and that's why we have the tensions that we're seeing right now.
Well, I wonder your thoughts on that and what the next step should be. If Iran doesn't think it can afford a wider war with Israel, and if Israel has the superior military, why not go for it now? If you're Israel, why not attack Iran's nuclear program while you have the opportunity?
Joe, it's easier said than done. Iran learned over the last few decades in terms of how to build and how to spread out, if you will, its nuclear facility. It's not one side or two or three sides, multiple sides. Across the country, the size of Iran, just to give you an example, is 3 times the size of the country of France. So, it's a major undertaking for Israel. I'm not sure if the Israelis militarily can do this on their own. And the big question is, will the United States go in and help them in such a mission? And to be honest, sitting here in Washington, following the debate, if you will, the United States clearly wants to help Israel in defending itself, but that's a very different matter than taking this country to a mission where you are taking out multiple, sites in Iran that could open a conflict that, as I said, I don't think this administration certainly is interested in.
Yeah, defense and offense are very different things, and that is important to point out here. As we consider, though, the idea that the U.S. would come to aid Israel, that you would see an alliance at work, knowing that in the attack Iran launched at Israel back in April, it was not just the U.S. that was helping defensively, but the U.K., Jordan was involved in that as well. I wonder what you think would realistically happen if we were to see more retaliation between Iran and Israel, if the U.S. were to get more materially involved. Who else is drawn in? Is anyone going to come to Iran's defense other than the proxies that it has been funding and have been materially weakened by the Israeli military's efforts over the last year?
So, Kailey, I think that's exactly the right question to ask. And frankly, I think the answer to that is Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, I should say, is strategically alone. I would be very hard-pressed to point out a country that I could say for sure will come and side with Iran in a war where Israel and Iran are fighting it out. The Russians are not going to come to Iran's aid, regardless of all the pleasantries that you hear Vladimir Putin and Ali Khamenei in Tehran exchange. The Chinese are not going to come to Iran's aid. The Arab world, by and large, is going to, at best, sit at the sidelines, watch this. And frankly, a lot of these Arab governments, particularly in the Gulf states, they're happy to see Israel destroy Hezbollah, Hamas, these non-state Arab militant actors. So the Iranians have a number of proxy groups that they can maybe rely upon. But look, the biggest of them all was Hezbollah, an entity Iran invested in for 42 years, hundreds of millions of dollars. And in the span of a few weeks, we've seen Israel destroy much of Hezbollah's capability. So this is not a moment for Iran to gamble and go into a conflict that militarily it really is, as I said, in a strategically lonely place and at a major disadvantage.
Is it a moment for Israel to make a major move against Iran without the blessing of the United States?
Look, that's obviously what Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying. He's even talking about helping the Iranian people help themselves from this Islamist regime. I don't know what the Israelis have in mind in terms of planning. If it's serious, that would be a game changer. That could be the outcome of the last year, where you say, if you're Israel, you say to the world, look, if you want sustained stability in the Middle East, there's only one way forward, which is either this Iranian regime entirely changes its regional agenda, pulls back in and focuses on Iranian national interest, or you go for the jugular, as I said, you go for regime change. I don't know what Israel will end up doing, but right now, obviously, they have multiple fronts. They're fighting Hamas, now increasingly in Lebanon. And who helps Israel in this mission? Again, that's another major question mark for me. So a lot of moving parts in all of this. But I just want to say finally on this issue of Iran, this fight that the Iranian regime has picked against Israel is really an ideological a project of a few men at the top of the echelons of power in Tehran. This is not Iran's fight. Whatever one thinks of the Arab-Israeli conflict, that's between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And Iran is just throwing stone at it. It's not helping. And what we've seen is Iranian actions and those of the proxies that are aligned with Iran is just destabilizing the region further.
Well, we've had many questions throughout the last year of around leverage and influence, both in terms of the U.S. ability to exercise leverage over Israel, influence its own military decisions, whether it comes to conduct in Gaza or now in Lebanon, questions around Iran's ability to influence its own proxies. And there's also the question of how U.S. policy is able to influence Iranian behavior directly. We heard from President Biden today talking about the prospect of more sanctions. There are sanctions in place. Republicans, including Senator J.D. Vance on the debate stage last night, argued that they have been not enough, that it's been effectively appeasement of Iran. Will further sanctions, make a difference in behavior here, do you believe?
To be honest, I don't think more sanctions alone is going to cut it anymore. I mean, Iran today is the second most sanctioned country on earth after the Russian Federation, over 5,000 sanctions. And Iran's been under one sanction or another since 1983, when the State Department put them on the terrorism list, sponsor of terrorism for the first time. So a long time. There's a whole industry in Iran where basically people are engaged in cutting around sanctions, and there are like-minded countries out there that share this sort of anti-Americanism that the Islamic Republic has, most notably Russia, China, North Koreas of this world. They get together, they go around the sanctions. And the tragedy in all of this for the Iranian people is, while the regime can, go around sanctions and survive for another day, this is costing the Iranian nation hundreds of billions of dollars each year in lost economic potential. Because guess what? Nobody's going to invest in Iran, which should be one of the largest economies, certainly in the Middle East, if not beyond that. So this is an Iranian regime that has chosen a foreign policy that really is costing the Iranian nation dearly. And if you're sitting in Washington, whether you're President Biden, whether you're President Trump, you have an Iranian counterpart that really seriously doesn't want to cut deals, I would argue. And I know a lot of people will push back and say, well, they signed a nuclear deal in 2015. It was the American side that walked away. That's one side of the story. The reality is you cannot have an Iran that signs nuclear deals or other agreements with the U.S. on certain issues while it wants to kick the United States and Israel out of the Middle East. They just don't go hand in hand. If you want to be normal, you have to be 100% normal. You can't be 50% normal. And that's the challenge for the Iranian regime right now, and the path they have to choose going forward.
Well, the timing is not lost on us here, Alex. The fact that this attack took place on the eve of the start of the Jewish High Holy Days. What is going to transpire with that in mind in the next 10 days as Iran looks at the calendar?
Look, Joe, I got to think that this Iranian regime is not that confident, that they were really in a bad place. I don't think they wanted to do what they did yesterday with those, firing those missiles. I think they want to stay to the game plan, which is the long war against Israel, have the proxies, throw whatever their proxies can throw at Israel over a long period of time, bleed Israel, to the extent that what the Iranian regime media will call reverse Jewish migration, that people that over the last few decades and so on moved to Israel decide, this place isn't safe enough, I'm going back. That is the Iranian wishful thing that's going on here. But the killing of Hassan Nasrallah really put him in an awkward position. It was the moment where emperor has no clothes on. And this was the man that they had handpicked, cultivated for years. Suddenly he was gone. And everybody in the region, among the proxies of Iran that Iran is working with, were looking for Iran to do something. And for Iran not to have done anything would have been, in many ways, the end of them as a leader of the axis of resistance. And that's what I think they did, but they're still hoping that this big Israeli retaliation that some Israeli reports are suggesting is coming is not going to come, because that might give Iran a way out of this too. They cannot afford, as I said before, they're strategically alone in this. They cannot afford a regional war. And again, let me emphasize, the Iranian people are against this war. So they can't even depend on their own people to rally around the flag, because the people of Iran, by and large, from what I can tell, are blaming the regime for having brought this on the people of Iran.
Alex, it's great to have you back. We thank you for the insights. Alex Vatanka, director of the Iran Program and senior fellow Black Sea Program at the Middle East Institute.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Late night and an early morning, we all managed to get back to the Capitol to be with you today here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite radio, and on YouTube, where you can find us right now. Search Bloomberg Business News Live, and you'll find our live stream. Yes, once again, connecting New York to D.C. This day after the big debate, as we're reminded, of course, of the natural disaster that we're trying to recover from in the southeastern states, and the campaign does turn its attention back there, beginning with the commander-in-chief himself, Joe Biden, traveling to South Carolina. He will move on to North Carolina, getting an operational briefing, an aerial tour of the damage from Hurricane Helene. Kamala Harris headed to Georgia. She'll get a briefing there as well, see the devastation left from the storm, knowing, of course, that Donald Trump was there just a couple of days ago here as we gauge the federal response. But of course, that's just one of the major stories that made the backdrop for our debate last night. A massive natural disaster that, by the way, might end up pulling lawmakers back into town for a supplemental funding request. A remarkable moment as Iran attacks Israel for the second time directly in 6 months. And the start of a dock workers' strike. 45,000 workers off the job. Ports are closed up and down the East Coast. It is not often that we have moments like this. Now less than 5 weeks from Election Day. And I'm glad to say that we're joined by Frank Luntz. This is the voice we wanted on the day after. And of course, you know Frank from this program, politics communications consultant, Pollster CEO of FIL Inc. Frank, it's great to see you. Welcome back. I want to ask your thoughts on the debate, but before I do that, your thoughts on this moment that we are in now, the significance of this many major stories impacting at once. It's going to take us a long time to unpack and understand this moment. What does it mean for voters?
But this is life, and I'm sorry that this is not the voice that I wanted to present to you, but I was up so late last night conducting the focus group. And your viewers, I hope, are going to have a chance to listen to it. This is life. This is who we are right now. Weather issues, political issues, global issues, economic issues, cultural and social issues, all hitting at the same time is basically what we're going through right now. And it's something you should become accustomed to. I even see the instability in the marketplace. Why stocks are going up and down so quickly and so intensely. We use that word instead. I think this is going to be part of what America's like for the coming weeks, months, and even years. And that just as investors get used to instability and unpredictability, Americans are going to have to get used to it as well, because this is how we are living our lives in October of 2024.
So how do people make sense of this moment, and how does a pollster like yourself find any truth amid all the noise? You mentioned your focus group. You sat down with 14 people last night post-debate, I believe 4 of whom were women. They're looking down the barrel of this campaign right now with less than 5 weeks to go, and every day there's a shock in this news cycle that might turn your attention or your opinion one way or the other.
Well, I actually tell them to watch Bloomberg, listen to Bloomberg. There's not a shred of partisanship on this coverage, not a shred of ideology. It's simply, this is what happens, this is what you need to know, and this is how you can benefit from it. That's exactly what the public is looking for. And it's very tough to find since we are so polarized and so divided. And in fact, if I can refer back to that debate, there was a different tone last night. How many times did Governor Walz and Senator Vance refer to each other and say, I agree, or I understand that, or I have compassion for you? It's a different kind of discussion than we had with Trump and with Harris just a few weeks ago. Last night was the discussion the American people want to have. Last night they spoke about issues, they spoke about details, they gave you a good idea of who they were as vice president, and more importantly, what their administration would seek to accomplish. I thought it was so good for democracy. I thought it was something so constructive that I wanted to bring it to Bloomberg, because you'll all appreciate this. It's exactly what your viewers want to hear and see.
You tweeted, I saw this last night, this VP debate is a model of how political discourse should work. Of course, the first thing that we're supposed to ask coming off the debate is who won. And I know that you were asking your focus group that. It's a pretty lopsided result, Frank. What did you think?
Yes, it was very much for Vance. And Vance went in with a lot of doubts that, because one of the things we do, which is awesome, is that we ask people before the debate, what are your initial impressions? And let me be candid with you. The initial impressions of Senator Vance were quite negative, and there were people who were voting for Trump that did not like his vice presidential pick, and people who were voting for Harris because of Trump's vice presidential pick. And that was not the reaction throughout the debate. Every time there's a commercial break, I have the opportunity to seek out their point of view. So we listened to voters 55 minutes into the debate, and then again an hour and almost 30 minutes into the debate, and the conclusions were clear and almost universal. Number one, both candidates dealt with the issues and gave specifics. Number two, both candidates were forthcoming with answers to really tough questions. However, Walz fell short in being candid about issues such as inflation and about his previous service and what he would do with the border. Vance had the advantage. The only criticism of Vance was that he would not defend and would not articulate opposition to Donald Trump claiming that the 2020 election was stolen or rigged. Other than that, the public, and these are one-time undecided voters, gave Vance the edge because they thought he was more willing to deal with facts, more willing to be specific, and most importantly, more willing to set out exactly what needs to happen in the future rather than going back and relitigate what happened between 2016 and 2020.
Well, let's walk through a couple of these moments that you mentioned here, Frank. Indeed, Tim Walz had some trouble with a couple of questions early on that you would have expected that he would be prepared for, including this controversy over when he was actually in China and whether he was in Hong Kong at the time of Tiananmen Square. I just want to go back to the debate last night for that exchange, the way he handled that moment where he was given the opportunity to clean this up.
Just to follow up on that, the question was, can you explain the discrepancy?
All I said on this is I got there that summer and misspoke on this. So I will just, that's what I've said. So I was in Hong Kong and China during the democracy protests went in. And from that, I learned a lot of what needed to be in governance.
He had some trouble with that one, and I'm guessing that that's something that they worked on in prep, knowing that he was doing mock debates. Frank, I wonder your thoughts on that. And I saw another post on X last evening during the debate, that moment in which Tim Walz, for some reason, said that he was friends with school shooters. I guess he meant to say he'd become friends with victims of school shootings. Does this matter, for the voter?
It doesn't. Voters are very forgiving. Voters believe in a term that I'll use for your listeners, grace, and they will allow people to make a misstep. But if they think that you're ducking the question, that is unforgivable when you're only 5 weeks away from the election. And they thought that Tim Walz was much more likely to duck the questions than J.D. Vance. And in particular, when you're talking about either immigration or national security or personal security, the idea that you aren't crystal clear and explicit, you'll get punished by the electorate. And that was his single worst moment of the debate. I didn't even know that that was his excuse. Sounds reasonable to me, but last night, the group that I was watching was really unforgiving that he would say such a thing. And this is what makes for a debate winner and a debate loser.
You mentioned 2020, Stop the Steal came up, and I think many saw this as the best moment for Tim Walz last evening. Here's how this went, the exchange between both candidates.
He is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation?
Interesting reply there, Frank. Did J.D. Vance do damage to the ticket last night with that answer?
No, but it was not an effective answer. And the fact is, when J.D. Vance was asked to defend some of the more ridiculous comments that Donald Trump has made, that was not helpful to Vance. But Vance is a better defender of Donald Trump than even Trump is himself. Vance presents the context for every issue. He doesn't go crazy. He doesn't say things that voters listen and they think to themselves, what the hell? Donald Trump should be winning this election, to be clear, on the issue of inflation, which I call affordability, because that's what voters say. On the issue of immigration, which I refer to as personal and national security. On these two key issues, Trump has a distinct advantage. But Trump himself is his own worst enemy, is his own worst communicator. All you need to do on the Republican side, again, to defeat Donald Trump, is simply use his own words against him. And J.D. Vance last night gave a better defense, a full-throated, effective, articulate defense of the Trump campaign. If J.D. Vance was on TV like he was last night, every night for the next 33 days, Donald Trump would win. But he won't be. And in the end, Trump will demand to be the center of attention. He'll demand to be the focus of all the video, of all the cameras, of all the lights. And every time Trump does that, he loses votes. Conversely, Walz was better than Harris because he was more specific than Harris. He was more detailed than Harris. He gave you more context than Harris, and he didn't waste time like Harris does deflecting the questions. So here we have a situation where both vice presidential candidates were superior to their presidential campaign. It's amazing to me, but it's also very uplifting because in the end, our focus group participants loved the tone, the contents, and the context of what they heard last night, and they thought it was an example of democracy at its best, which is the first time in 2024 that they've said anything like that.
Well, and again, I believe it was 12-2. Your panel, your focus group of 14 people, 2 votes for Tim Walz, 12 for J.D. Vance. What happened in the room? What did you hear from people during that exchange about 2020?
Well, here's the great thing is that I'm following the text. So they're making comments at the same time that I'm interviewing them. And as the debate is running, they're commenting in the chat box. And when they got to the 2020 election, almost to the person, they were disappointed. They were disillusioned by Vance's response. See, most Americans have moved on from 2020, and even though Vance wanted to do so, he should have looked straight in the camera and say, I accept the results. Now let's focus on 2024. He didn't do that. He probably didn't do that because Trump would have punished him for doing that. That said, it was not enough to tilt the participation of the focus groups, not enough to tilt them in the direction of Walz, but it really was Vance's worst moment of the debate.
Yeah. I only have a minute left, Frank. You also made clear on Twitter and following your focus group that maybe these were the two candidates who should be at the top of the ticket, that they had more to offer than their running mates. Is that your takeaway?
It is, and it's not serious. It's obvious that there's the second fiddle. It's obvious that they're the warm-up act. But there's a message in that, which is we can do better than what we have. We don't have to have a horrific campaign. We don't have to tear each other apart and show disrespect and delegitimize and dehumanize the opposition. Last night, we had a great debate, focused on content, told the American people where the candidates want to go, and it was productive and successful. And my only hope is the candidates, the presidential candidates, are listening and they raise their game. And they understand that they can make a positive difference versus their opponents.
You better believe they were listening. Frank, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for peeking out of one eye and doing this on fumes. Frank Luntz, CEO, FIL, a conversation you tuned in for right here only on Bloomberg. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.